Afternoon, everybody. Just afternoon, only just this minute. So, obviously, we've done a couple of these webinars now, and we're going to be doing one every month, at least for the next 12 months, as we go through our move to place-based working. And we had a couple of questions in terms of how actually come up with our model in terms of how do you classify a community. If you think about, one of the oldest tenets of geography is the concept of place itself, and that can have numerous definitions from just a location on a map to the more complex, having physical and human characteristics that are interconnected. And generally there's three components of place: the locale, the location, the sense of place, and there might be more. So one of the questions for Bromford to start asking was, what is a place, and what does a place mean to Bromford as well as its customers and its stakeholders? And I'm joined on the call by Mark, our economist, Henry Waters, data scientist, and Angela Manson, who is our place leader for Staple Hill. And I'm innovation coach. And I think it's going to be a really good session. We're going to get into some of the detail in terms of some of the data, in terms of what we've done. We're going to run for about 20, 25 minutes and then have a Q&A session. This is quite a complex area, so we're open to any question, and we don't profess to have all the answers at all. So I think we will kick off. And I think what I'll do, Mark, is start with you. This is such a broad area. And as I said, I know we don't have all the answers yet, but where did we start in defining our places?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is such a kind of broad topic, and you can take it in lots of different directions, really. And some of the directions that we've been in have been a bit of a dead end. So I think it's important to kind of explore mistakes and the corrections that we've explored along the way as well. So yeah, we kind of started with essential questions about what is a place, what is a community, what should that be centered around? Should it be centered around Bromford properties, the types of property that they are? Should it be centered around different groups of customers? Should it be centered around, kind of like public assets, schools, hospitals, things like that, central business districts where people work, or shopping hubs? And you can get quite bogged down in all of that. And I think we did for quite a while, and it was quite a slow start for that reason. And kind of because of, thinking that a sense of community can be centered around so many different things, we ended up collecting something like 50 different data sets around customer, around property, and around kind of external community and kind of, other stakeholders in the area too. And we kind of struggled a bit after that, too much data, if anything. And then trying to kind of make sense of that becomes increasingly difficult. And because of that, I think we then called on some expert help, thinking that would be the answer to problems, engaged with an external consultancy. And we kind of almost just handed it over as in, like, we don't really know what we're doing. Can you help us? Where are our places? But we didn't really give them any parameters about how to kind of limit that analysis at all. And it's kind of, I think along the way, we have recognized the limits of data and data analysis, that it's very, very good at answering discrete questions if you give it, a really tight brief, some predefined parameters to kind of contain the analysis. Even really complicated questions, as long as you're quite specific about what you're asking. It's not very good at answering, very open questions. Where are our places? So I think that's the brief history really about so how do we kind of turn an open question of where are our places to trying to create a really tight brief around that.
Great. And I probably should have said at the beginning, actually, because I've just noticed we've got people outside of sector on the call, including people who are working data science, that part of this was about actually Bromford almost flipping its model and thinking from the point of view of bottom up from community and designing and delivering services in that way. So this was the necessary first step. So Mark, where then have we got to?
So this is kind of almost a little bit of a framework for how we've conducted the analysis, like the broad principles of how we've conducted it. So kind of since we engaged with that external consultancy, we've actually brought in some in-house expertise. So Henry's on the call with us and the team around him as well, and the data science team. So myself and others kind of came up with these broad parameters for how we're going to do it. The really kind of core tenet, I suppose, is number one on the screen there. Groups of properties should be, collated based on how close they are. That's a really broad logic that underlines all of it, that, customers that live closer together are more likely to be part of the same community than customers who live far apart. It's quite simple on the face of it, but you can't then just say, so where do you draw the boundaries around one community to the next? And there's always going to be a trade-off there between trying to keep it customers and properties within one place. You want them to be as similar as possible, which that leans you towards creating smaller clusters, smaller places. But that is always a trade-off between that and the feasibility of serving those places. We can't give dedicated colleague time to a group of 10 properties. It's just not big enough. Just for scale, we own about just under 50,000 properties in the West Midlands and the Southwest. So kind of it's not feasible to have really, really small clusters as well. So it's how do you manage that trade-off really? And we try to do that with these kind of other principles. So numbers 2, 3, 5, which are basically used to limit the scope of difference within places. So I'd say number 2, so we defined using ONS data sets whether the places that properties sit are urban or rural. The difference in lived experience between people in those places we think is probably quite profound, and therefore it made sense to split them up and consider them separately. Number 3, we wanted all properties within the same place to be in the same local authority. That's trying to simplify the processes and communication and external engagement for those place-based colleagues. Different local authorities quite often have different processes, and we wanted to make it as simple as possible for our colleagues working in place-based teams. Using some data science and some data analysis that Henry might talk a bit more about later, we use something called the elbow method, which is essentially trying to find the sweet spot for the size of property clusters that gives us the simplest answer to how big clusters should be, which is around 450 in this case. And that also ties neatly in with they are just about big enough to warrant dedicated colleagues working full-time in those places too. And this minimum weighted density score is essentially how closely, geographically, how close together are the properties. And we didn't want really big clusters covering really big spaces. We thought that would defeat the object of place-based working, and therefore we wanted to set a limit on kind of how big the spread of those communities can be. This is a look at our geography. Every dot on the map here is a Bromford property. So you can see very well that our geography is not uniform across it all. You have what we call the Big Four in some of our local authorities, in South Gloucestershire, in the Cotswolds, in Lichfield, and in Tewkesbury. We own more than 50% of the social housing, and therefore we have very densely situated properties. But you can see in between that there's lots of different, more scattered satellite properties in between. So it's how do you create a single method that works to group up both very sparsely populated areas and very densely populated areas too? How do you come up with that blanket approach? We just bring up this square here. So we're going to focus in a little bit more. So this is South Gloucestershire on the edge of Bristol down here, but we're going to focus in there to show you how the method works to make it a little bit clearer.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to Henry. So let's start with Romford are lucky enough to have a team of data scientists. What the heck is a data scientist and what do you do?
I think at data science, we're a bit like data detectives. So we start off building a case by collecting the evidence or collecting the data into data sets. And then we interrogate the data using maths and coding to basically try and uncover patterns or the truth that's hiding amongst all that noisy data. But the end goal is always to add some clarity to business decision making. So it changes now depending on where you go, but generally that's the gist of it. A bit of a data detective is how I describe the role.
I think that's a brilliant description. I think it really explains it in a couple of words, gives us a really good idea. So how have you approached this in terms of how have you used data to define what makes a place, and what have been some of the challenges?
So it really goes back to what Mark was saying, that we make the assumption that customers that live closer together are more likely to be part of the same community. It keeps things simple. It allows during the discovery process to fail quickly, but then also learn quickly, which I think is key to help move things on. So, based off my studies, this really looked like a job for clustering. So clustering is essentially partitioning data into distinct groups based on the similarity of some feature of that data. So in our case, keeping it simple, we just took 2 features, which is the longitude and latitude coordinates for each one of our properties. As Mark was alluding to earlier, you can build these huge data sets, but that just adds complexity and more things to unpick when things go wrong. So to begin the clustering, I picked a quite simple model called K-means, if you can see on the slide. And basically how it works, it's an iterative machine learning model, which means it will go through the stages that we see in the panels on the right there, step by step, until it reaches its conclusion. Broadly how it works, if you imagine on panel A, the green dots are our properties, and so far they have not been clustered. So the first step is to initialize some random cluster centers. And in this case, we choose 2 clusters just for simplicity. So we set k, which is one of the parameters, to equal 2. So that's where the k in k-means comes from. The second iterative step of that algorithm is to then assign each data point a cluster membership. And that's determined by which cluster center are they closest to. So we can see the blue dots are closest to the blue X and the red ones are closer to the red X. Then the second step, which gets iterated over throughout this, is to then determine where's the average position now of these newly formed clusters. So in panel C, we can see that the blue X has moved to be roughly where the average position of the blue dots are, and the red where the average position of the red dots are. The step after that is to reassign each data point to its new closest cluster center. So we can already see some clarity beginning to form about a quite naturally looking cluster. And again, we just go through that step stage by stage until data points no longer change cluster membership. That's when the algorithm knows that it's reached the optimal cluster configuration. So the mean part of k-means come from setting that average position at each stage. So it's efficient on large data sets. It allows us, crucially, to say how many clusters we want, which is important for the various business rules that we had, like Mark spoke about, 450 properties per cluster, same local authority district, that sort of thing. But the one downside to k-means is that it will cluster absolutely everything. So if there was a property that was 1,000 miles away from the blue cluster center and 1,001 miles away from the red cluster center, it would still say it belongs to the blue. But as humans looking at it, we'd say that's probably not belonging to either of them. The second stage of clustering was to use a different algorithm over the top of the k-means called dbScan, which stands for density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise. And essentially, as well as looking at distance between points, it also looks at the number of points within that distance, which is just another way of saying density, really. So we can see on the right there, we have our core points. So we've set one of the parameters, minimum points, to be 5. And we have a distance called epsilon, but we can call it whatever we want. And let's just pretend epsilon is 1 kilometer. So we can see for the core cluster, there are 5 minimum points within that epsilon distance. So the algorithm recognizes that as being a cluster core. But when we look at the noise points, for example, not only do they not touch that core cluster, they also don't have that minimum 5 points within that epsilon distance. So that's really helpful for making sure that that one property I spoke about that was 1,000 miles away doesn't get classified as being part of that cluster. It instead gets classified as by the algorithm noise, but what we'd say is just a different operating model. It isn't part of a place. It has its benefits and its downsides. One of the downsides is you cannot predict the number of clusters it will come up with, which is what made it a bad choice for the first stage clustering, but made it a really good choice for the second stage clustering, because we already knew how many clusters we were going to show it. So we could kind of control that. We'll see how this translates to going from a geography where everything is the same to having our core points and then our noise points, and essentially showing us where our places are and where they're not.
That's really useful to help us kind of track the kind of thinking from the kind of data science level to the practical application. So moving to that then, Mark, what results has that method turned out?
Exactly, basically, as Henry has outlined there, it basically splits up our properties into 2 separate groups, kind of core properties, and don't want to call them noise properties, but kind of call them core and non-core kind of thing. Essentially, clusters that are really tightly packed and properties that are not. So if we're just looking at South Gloucestershire, if we click on, we can see that the method has sorted it out into coloured dots and kind of grey diamonds. So grey diamonds are those kind of noise data points, what we call non-core properties. And then we have these coloured circles, and obviously each different colour is a different cluster. So it essentially helps us sort out more or less the first step, at least, into where our places are. And yeah, so I think that kind of covers the general method.
So I know we're still going through it and we're still doing a lot of thinking, but what have been your reflections so far? What would we do differently?
So I think people would probably guess as from the first slide that I brought up, but is keeping it really simple, having a really simple guiding principle. Obviously, the algorithms that are underlying it, as Henry explained, are quite complicated, but the real guiding principle is really simple, and only adding kind of additional complexity to that as a last resort. And as Henry said, because we kept it simple, we were able to fail fast and make amendments as we go. And another reflection is that, data is great, but a use case for that data is even better. That's the underlying answer that you're trying to reach, the underlying reason for including it. the last one there, kind of involving people who know the community as well as early as possible, been really important. So kind of once we first engaged with that external consultancy, we had an answer to come back to the business with. And our very first interaction with kind of place-based colleagues basically changed our entire approach to how we were doing it, and kind of reflecting that involving them at an earlier stage would have been really useful and potentially saves some time. They are essentially the best data source that we have.
Yeah, thinking of your people as data sources as well. I think that's a great tip and a good lesson learned. So moving on to the kind of the people side, Angela. Obviously, this data was used to assemble a place-based team, and you are the first place lead. Now, previously, you've led colleagues who have served different places, but not one place. What's been the difference in terms of moving from managing lots of little places or whatever to focusing on leading a place rather than just managing it?
Hi, everybody. As you say, Paul, I used to line manage colleagues, but place team leader leads and coordinates them. The colleagues within place still report to their previous line managers. So what this means is it frees up my time more so that I can focus on new initiatives, networking, driving things forward without becoming involved in that management side of things. I think personally for me as well, working this close to 15 other colleagues from across the business, I have gained so much more knowledge and experience of what their role entails. Previously, when I managed the team, I may have to drive 45 minutes to get to see some of my team. Obviously, now they're all based very, very closely within half a mile of each other. So it's much easier for me to see them, as it is with the rest of the colleagues within the team.
There are challenges, though, aren't there, in terms of even our first assemblage of a place team? It doesn't exactly match, does it? Because we've got some colleagues whose roles serve outside that place. So that is still a challenge, isn't it, for us?
Yeah, certainly. We've got a couple of the neighbourhood coaches whose patch is half in place and half out of place.
And that is something that we deliberately wanted to leave at this stage because we don't want to start moving things while we're testing them out, do we? So it's something that will evolve over time, and hopefully we can ultimately get the kind of the data and the people and the customer view all to kind of match in terms of how we look at those things. Thinking about, about actually why we started with Staple Hill. Where did that come from? Tell us a little bit about Staple Hill itself.
So Staple Hill is classed as a priority neighbourhood. And what that means is that there are high levels of deprivation in Staple Hill, and that could be income deprivation, employment, education, health, etc. Also, Staple Hill is a very high density area. We've got a lot of properties there that are all within very close proximity to each other. And when we looked internally within Bromford, this area had a high level of demand on repairs, hard to let properties, antisocial behaviour, and low customer thrive advocacy scores. So we're all based there. So we're all very, very close. The customers can see us more now. We're much more visible there. We can respond a lot quicker to things. We've got 2 engineers that just focus purely on this area. So we can respond a lot quicker to repairs. We've got 16 of us in the team, and there's that support around. You've got 15 other colleagues around you. You can ask questions quicker, you'll get responses quicker. If there's a shout out for assistance, then those colleagues can respond a lot quicker. And the customers are getting to know us now, and they see that we're present and that we care about the community.
Can you just explain a little about the engineers in terms of, because they've been postcode mapped now to this area, and tell us kind of how different that is?
Yeah, so we've just got the 2 day-to-day engineers, and we put in the postcodes for the Staple Hill place and what their skills are, so carpentry, etc. And they will then, as soon as jobs come in for the place space in Staple Hill, it will automatically be assigned to those 2 engineers. So what's the benefit of that for customers is that they've got the same engineers that are coming into their property, so they're building up that relationship. And we get sight as a team of the engineers' calendars on a daily basis, so we can see where they are. The benefit of that is that the neighbourhood coaches could piggyback onto any of those visits. So again, the benefit for the customer is they might have previously had to take time off work for 2 appointments, the neighbourhood coach and the repair. Now we can coordinate that so we can do 1 visit. So they've only got to take 1 set of time off work, or if we've got customers that actually have a bit of anxiety about us visiting, again, it's just one visit instead of the 2 visits.
Right. So it's a really good example of taking that kind of the modelling that Mark and then Henry outlined in terms of the data, and then assembling people around that, and bringing those 2 things together. Fantastic. Let's move on to a final question for you, Mark. We're working to kind of 4 place archetypes at the moment, aren't we? Can you describe those in terms of what we're exploring?
This is, again, very much a work in progress. Like you say, this is exploratory stuff, and this may well change along the way. But we kind of first thought about how do we try and make sure that place-based working can work in all different types of communities, ones that are, thriving, close-knit communities, and those that aren't. Like there's a spectrum across different places. And the way that we tried to capture that is that we have our own kind of Thrive metric that we've adopted here at Bromford, and that's attached to each customer in each property. And that's kind of a proxy for their kind of well-being, be that financial, be that whether the home is suitable for them, whether they're able to heat it and be warm and comfortable, and also the sense of community around that as well, and how well Bromford contribute to that. So that's kind of one element of the matrix that we see across the top, and we have kind of split those into high and low. And also density. We kind of mentioned before, particularly around Staple Hill, that there's a high demand for repairs. So there's essentially trying to split out different types of places into how much or how many contacts between customers and Bromford there are. That tells you something about their requirements as customers, tells you something about the types of properties that are there, and also gives us a clue as to which external partners that we should be seeking to work with to try and seek better outcomes. And also, frankly, how well our current operating model at Bromford works for that community or not. We kind of split those into 4, so we can see that we've started 2 of the pilots in Staple Hill and more recently in South Lichfield too, and we'll be looking to run 2 more in the new year.
Mark, before we just go to questions, what would you say are the next steps?
Yeah, really quickly, I think the overarching message that I want to get across from this is that we really do want place-based working to be a truly bottom-up exercise. And I appreciate that some colleagues and customers won't feel that they've been able to contribute to this exercise. However, that will change in the very near future. We've just kind of concluded those first internal consultations with colleagues. We will be coming to kind of neighbourhoods and community managers for them to consult with their teams, and also into the future with other external stakeholders and customers too. And yeah, they're very much a work in progress, and we don't have all the answers yet.
I mean, that question about the whole customers and stakeholders has come up quite a lot. And one of the things that we obviously had to do, as you alluded to, was to start somewhere and to get those teams assembled, to get them in place and to start working on things, because our view was that actually as soon as we started working, we'd generate feedback and we could iterate from there. Right, so a couple of questions. I'll go to you, Mark, first, because it kind of builds on what you were saying. So a question from Paul Roberts, who said, do you pull out any clusters based on customer needs in a location, i.e. a small supported housing scheme in its own community or part of the wider community in the neighbouring streets?
Yeah, sure. So I think my answer would be, the way that you define a community, I don't think should be the amount of times that they contact Bromford, i.e. using demand as a proxy for where your community boundaries are. To me, that doesn't sound like how a customer would identify themselves. However, it is obviously important to recognise that within communities there are, customers with specific needs. But for me, that shouldn't define where the boundaries are, but that should be a consideration for a place team leader in how they operate within their place-based team.
Yeah, have you got anything you want to add to that, Angela?
There's several branches for Staple Hill, there's investment, etc. The repairs, yes, that's something that we can measure and hope to reduce, but it's also about the lack of community feel that they have at the moment. As I said, we've got very highly densely populated areas, but they don't feel part of the community. They feel cut off. They don't feel they have a great relationship with Bromford, which is something that we want to work on. So yeah, there's lots, not just with demand on repairs, no.
Then conversely, you've got a lot of people living there who are very proud of the actual place, aren't they? Despite what you just said there about the challenges, it's about not ignoring that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And they want to, they do want to work with us to improve where they live. Unfortunately, Staple Hill doesn't have the best reputation, and that's something that's going to take time, and we need to understand how we can turn that around.
I've had a question from Chris. I missed the start of this, but so Chris makes the point that I don't know if you've got an in-house GIS team with so much of your analysts using spatial data. Would it be a worthwhile investment? But also, can I just ask that to Henry in terms of have we considered that or ruled it out, and what other data sources could be brought in to refine this model?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the work that I did on place-based was essentially GIS work, using coordinate systems, geocoding at the start. So I'm personally quite passionate about GIS. I think it's quite a fascinating topic. So in terms of our in-house team, that is the data science team. And we've got the skills to do geographical work on a notebook or on commercial platforms. And I think that's key, because whilst there are some really great tools out there, at the end of the day, it's very helpful to be able to, crack open the software and edit things as you want to customize it for our way, because essentially our geography is unique to ourselves. So yeah, it's definitely something that Bromford has invested in, continues to invest in, both in people term and in tools.
And have you got any thoughts, Henry, about how we could refine the model?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment we're only using 2 features for our properties, just where they are on the map. We have learned from our conversations with colleagues about what assets of community value are most likely to determine where a community sits. So bringing in data around things like distance to the nearest school or distance to a nearest asset of community value is something that I'm interested to bring in, but I'm also mindful that we tried to do that at the very start and it got complicated very quickly. So I think it would be something interesting to bring to add on to this model rather than to sort of replace it altogether. So basically data enrichment is something I'll be looking at for sure.
I think one vision for the model, or one possible vision anyway, something that I think would be interesting, and it relates to kind of Abigail's comment in the chat, talking about how do we identify additional or new places as we continue to build more homes. I think that's a really prescient point, particularly currently we've just mapped existing homes on there. It would be interesting then to do an exercise about how do you then overlay, potential land opportunities to build more homes. Like we said, the forward pipeline of homes, building that into it as well. So exactly as Abigail says, identify kind of new emerging places, but equally to help inform us, where's the best value building, or kind of where do we build the most value into existing communities, what types of properties we should be building where, and all these types of questions. I think it opens up a whole load of possibilities.
Laura from New Local, it's good to have you on the call, has asked a question that builds upon what Henry was saying, but maybe Mark can have a first go at this. What experience do you have engaging with VCS service provision, voluntary sector education, health, and other system players to work on place improvements? Now, we're at very early stages of talking about data sharing, aren't we, Mark? Could you kind of allude to a little bit of that?
Sure, yeah. So it's really encouraging, particularly in South Gloucestershire, where we've got kind of an emerging data agreement, that there's this kind of shared sense that moving to a place model, essentially, where you group up customers around that shared sense of community, is also a shared vision with the local authority too, and therefore kind of enriching that relationship with the local authority to kind of move towards shared goals within a single place, is a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that was really, for organisations like ours and local authorities, that could be kind of game changing in terms of how we develop that going forward in the future. Claire asks, do customers agree with the identity that the place definitions are driving? Do you think there'll be any tensions about grouping customers together in this way? Who wants to have a go at that?
I'll start. Potentially, yes. And the really honest answer is we don't know yet. I think the basic premise is we wanted to approach customers with a potential model rather than an open question of where do you think your community is. No doubt there will be some tension between where people make distinctions in the boundaries between them. But I think that's a really open conversation that we should be willing to have. We should not think that we have all the answers, as clever as our algorithms are. And even in these first consultations with our own colleagues, there's been kind of alterations to where those boundaries sit. So yeah, I think that's a very open conversation that we should be willing to have.
Yeah, we're happy sort of existing with that tension. Going back in terms of how we define specific demands, such as supported housing, that actually is something we'll pick up in the next webinar, because the next one will talk about pilot in South Lichfield, and that did come up there specifically in terms of a retirement living scheme being originally excluded. But we're trying to say we need to look at the place rather than individual scheme level at this time. So we will come back to that one. So I'm going to give the final question to Jeff Pearce, and you can have a go each at this one because it's a good one. If the panel had a vision for how far we could take this work in influencing Bromford's future strategy and intervention, what would it be? Henry, do you want to go first?
I think
how far could we take this?
It's such a tough one because, community from a data perspective, there's no data set out there that I'm aware of, at least, that tells me which community a person belongs to. And a person can belong to one community, two communities, no community. It's quite a difficult one. So I think just being able to use data to as accurately as possible reflect what the truth is on the ground. And we're lucky that we have so many neighborhood coaches that we can very quickly ask, hey, this is what the model says, what's the truth? And then adjust the model. So I think for me personally would be getting that model to such an extent that we're getting it accurate, and then we can then start looking at intervention, add in layers of public health layers, for example, to our clusters, and spotting outliers using clustering within our own clusters, something that might need a bit more intervention, for example. So I definitely see this as the foundation on which to build more intelligence on top of.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think it really, one really exciting thing is that it's transforming how we view, well, obviously the boundaries around communities, but kind of our sense of kind of our importance within communities has essentially been driven by how many properties we have in a single local authority, hence how we've kind of got to that model of having the big four local authorities where we own the majority of social housing. This gives us a way of identifying and, really investing heavily into potentially local authorities where we're not the major social housing provider, but within a subset of that local authority, we are kind of an anchor organisation and have, a responsibility to kind of contribute to community outcomes. So that's really exciting. I also think this gives us, I think the knock-on effect of building a model such as this is how that flips the relationship between colleagues that operate in a place-based way and currently other parts of the business that are there to serve those communities, and flipping that power dynamic essentially, rather than being told that this is what's happening in the community telling them this is what we need. I think that's a really exciting vision.
So I think it's very early days, obviously, for the two that are running, but already we're starting to see really encouraging positive results with how place-based working is going. And I think, to put it in its simplest terms, we want the community and our colleagues to thrive. And that's what we're working towards. And I think the more we can spread it, as Mark just said, spread it out across all of the teams within Bromford, so that we're all working in that way. And then hopefully we will achieve what we're setting out to achieve.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Henry, Mark, Angela, and thanks to everybody who has attended. As I've said before, please listen and subscribe to our podcast and follow our YouTube as well. These webinars will follow once a month from January on the second Friday of every month in the same time slot, 12 till 12:45. So please tell your friends and share. We want to hear your ideas as well going forward as well, because we know other people are working on this agenda, and we want to engage with you as well. So feel free if you want to contribute to these webinars in the future. It's nearly Christmas, so I'll say thank you ever so much for all the support you've given us this year. Thanks for all the colleagues' hard work, and have a wonderful Christmas holiday, whatever you're doing, and a wonderful new year. We'll see you soon.